The diner smelled of coffee gone bitter from sitting too long on the burner, of fried eggs, and of the faint trace of old smoke that clung to the cracked vinyl booths. The morning sun angled through the grimy windows, casting pale stripes across the worn linoleum floor. Brandon Atkins sat quietly in his usual spot, the corner booth where the wall met the window, his old field jacket folded beside him, his cap resting on the table. His hands, lined and weathered, cupped a steaming mug, the dark coffee inside trembling ever so slightly as the tremor in his fingers betrayed the years. Two men at the counter watched him. Robert and Jeff, early 30s, faces puffy from a long night, shirts wrinkled, eyes sharp with the bitterness of too much beer and too many losses. The town's election had not gone their way, and in the hollow ache of defeat, they looked for something, or someone, to take it out on. Robert smirked, elbowed Jeff, his voice low at first. "Look at that. Fossil's probably still dreaming of wars he never fought." Jeff snorted, loud enough that heads turned. "Bet he comes here just to feel important. Pathetic old man in a dead man's jacket." The diner seemed to shrink. The waitress, Emily, froze mid-step, coffee pot in hand. The cook paused behind the pass-through. No one spoke. No one moved. Brandon didn't lift his eyes. He stared into his cup, the silence around him louder than the taunts. His jaw tightened, his shoulders squared ever so slightly. A man standing at attention without leaving his seat. Outside, boots crunched on gravel, heavy, purposeful, nearing the door. The dawn had broken soft that morning, a pale light spreading across the edges of town like a promise. Brandon Atkins had been awake long before the first birds called out, before the sun had painted the rooftops gold. His small house, set back from the road, was simple but neat. White paint faded, porch steps creaking beneath his boots as he came out into the cool air. He moved slowly, not from frailty, but from care. At the base of the porch, a stray dog with one ear torn and a coat rough from life on the edge of kindness waited patiently. Brandon crouched, his knees protesting as he reached for the old tin bowl he kept filled. The dog ate as Brandon spoke in soft tones, the way one speaks to a friend rather than a beast. "You're still here, huh? Guess we're both too stubborn to move on." His garden was small, a row of tomatoes, a patch of herbs, a climbing rose that refused to bloom. He checked each one, brushing dirt from leaves, righting a bent stem. When he stood again, the sun had climbed just enough to warm his back. Inside, the house bore the marks of a life lived with purpose. A pair of boots, polished, though scuffed. A coat hung neatly on a hook. A photo on the mantel. Two young soldiers at a diner counter, grinning over mugs of coffee. Brandon and Paul Lopez, the friend who had not come home. Brandon dressed carefully. His field jacket, old but clean, was folded across the foot of the bed. He slipped it on as if donning armor, the fabric worn to softness by time and memory. In the inner pocket, his fingers found the medal that never left his side. Not for glory, not for show, but as a weight to remind him of promises made. The diner was part of his ritual, as much a part of his day as tending the garden or feeding the dog. A place where the world moved slow enough that a man could sit with his thoughts, with his ghosts, with his coffee. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, the scent of frying bacon and burnt toast wrapping around him like an old blanket. The same cracked booth, the same chipped mug set down by Emily with a quiet smile. And so he sat, as he had so many mornings before, his hands wrapped around the warmth of the cup, his gaze soft on the street beyond the window, his thoughts on another time when a friend had sat beside him at that very counter, the weight of duty still fresh on their young shoulders. But the peace of the moment had not lasted. The voices of Robert and Jeff, sharp with drink and bitterness, had pierced it, pulling him back from memory into a present that felt far colder than the dawn had been. And so he sat, silent still, as the taunts echoed, as the coffee grew cool between his hands, as the weight of the room's silence settled over him like a shroud. Outside, the crunch of boots on gravel came closer, the sound of purpose approaching, of the moment about to change. The diner, small and worn at the edges, seemed to shrink under the weight of the moment. The hum of conversation had faded, leaving only the tick of the wall clock and the hiss of grease on the griddle behind the counter. The air, thick with the scent of coffee and frying bacon, felt heavy now, as if even the walls held their breath. Robert leaned back on his stool, arms crossed, his smirk widening as he glanced around, daring anyone to challenge him. His voice rose just enough to fill the space between tables, sharp and mean in its mockery. "Old man probably comes here to feel like he still matters. Can't imagine why else anyone would bother." Jeff chuckled, the sound hollow, his face flushed from drink and spite. "Bet that jacket's from the thrift store. Soldier, my ass. Just another leech in uniform." Brandon's grip on his coffee tightened, the trembling in his hands more visible now, though not from fear. His gaze remained on the dark liquid in the mug, as if by sheer will he could remain apart from the ugliness unfolding around him. His shoulders, broad still beneath the faded jacket, squared just a little more. Emily shifted behind the counter, the coffee pot in her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes darted between the men and Brandon, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. The owner, a man who had seen too many mornings start just like this one, wiped the same spot on the counter over and over, saying nothing. Outside, the boots drew nearer, each step a slow drum beat, unnoticed by those too focused on the scene inside. Robert nudged Jeff, emboldened by the silence of the room. "Hey, hero," he called, his tone dripping with derision. "Tell us, you win the war all by yourself, or just lose your way home?" The words hung in the air, sour and heavy. Brandon lifted his eyes then, just enough to meet Robert's gaze across the room. His stare was steady, unblinking, the kind that spoke of battlefields far from this place, of losses that no insult could ever match. For a breath, Robert faltered, the weight of that look pressing back against his bravado. But pride and beer pushed him on. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Robert sneered, looking away too fast, his laughter forced. The memory rose then, unbidden and sharp. Brandon and Paul Lopez seated together at that very counter decades earlier. The world quieter then, for a brief moment between deployments. Paul's voice low, steady, speaking not of plans drawn on napkins, but of the precautions they'd review once they reached the base, of contingencies if their return route was ever cut, of promises made in the shadow of what they both knew could come. They had shared that meal before the mission, the last one together in peace, and when the moment came, when the safe route home was lost to gunfire and chaos, it was Paul who stood his ground, who bought the time they needed, who was no longer there when help arrived. The sound of boots reached the diner's door. The bell above it jangled as it swung open. A figure stepped inside, the air seeming to shift with his arrival. The bell above the diner's door chimed softly, but to Brandon Atkins, the sound might as well have come from another lifetime. His eyes stayed fixed on his cooling coffee, but the world before him blurred, overtaken by a memory etched deep into his heart. The diner faded, replaced by a time when hope and fear had shared the same space. It had been this same diner, all those years ago. The counter gleamed then, polished clean, the air filled with the low hum of a jukebox playing a tune that promised brighter days. Paul Lopez sat beside him, fatigue jacket open at the throat, sleeves pushed up, the dust of morning drills still clinging to him. His eyes were tired, but they held a light. A man who had not let war harden what was good inside him. Brandon could see him now, the way he leaned forward, elbows on the counter, coffee cupped in both hands. His voice had been low, words meant for no one but his friend. "Soon as this tour's done," Paul had said, fingers tracing the rim of his mug, "I'm asking Maria. Got it all set in my head. Little place near her folks. 2 kids, maybe 3. That's the dream. That's what I want after this." Brandon had nodded, the kind of nod that sealed a promise between brothers. He'd seen the small ring box buried deep in Paul's kit, hidden like a secret hope. Paul had done his duty without complaint, believing deep down that if he gave all that was asked, He'd earn his peace, his future. But the future hadn't waited. The memory shifted. The mission. The ambush that shattered the night. Their squad pinned down. The plan unraveling in the chaos of gunfire and confusion. There had been wounded among them. One man limping badly, another nearly unconscious. The safe escape route was cut off, the enemy too close on their heels. Paul had seen what needed doing. His voice had been steady as he gripped Brandon's arm. "They won't make it with a tail. Someone's got to slow them down." Brandon had known in that instant. Paul had resources, a rifle, grenades, his wits, but he was one man facing the unknown. His job wasn't to win. It was to buy time, just enough for the others to reach the rendezvous and for help to arrive. "I'll give you that window," Paul said, and before Brandon could protest, he was gone, moving toward the enemy with purpose, drawing fire, creating the distraction that saved lives. When help came, when the night finally quieted, Paul was gone, his body never found. His dream, of Maria, of the house, of the children he never held, lost to the shadows. Brandon drew a slow breath, the memory fading, but the ache sharp as ever. Around him the diner returned, the stale air, the weight of unspoken shame, the laughter of Robert and Jeff. But beneath it all, Brandon felt the truth of that night, the cost paid, the debt owed. And outside, the boots came closer, each step a promise that the moment was about to change. The diner door's bell gave a soft jingle, a sound that somehow seemed sharper, clearer than it had any right to be. The air changed as the figure stepped inside, as if the room itself had been waiting for this moment. The weight of the morning, the bitterness that had filled the space, seemed to still, like dust settling after a storm. Commander Richard Cole paused just inside the threshold, the sunlight behind him casting his silhouette long across the worn linoleum floor. He stood tall, mid-50s, the kind of man whose posture spoke of years in uniform, of discipline carried not as burden, but as second nature. His service jacket, clean but well worn, bore the soft creases of use rather than ceremony. Dust clung to the toes of his boots, the mark of a man who'd already walked miles this day, seeing to the quiet business of duty. His eyes, sharp beneath a brow furrowed by time and responsibility, swept the diner in a single glance. He took it all in, the tense stillness, the faces turned toward him, the frozen postures of those caught between shame and defiance. And then his gaze found Brandon Atkins. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to fade. Richard's eyes softened, just enough to show the depth of recognition, of respect. There was no need for words between them in that moment. Brandon's chin rose slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared, forged long ago on fields far from this small town. Robert shifted on his stool, unease prickling down his spine. The smirk he'd worn so easily moments before faltered, slipping beneath the weight of Richard's steady gaze. Jeff, slower to sense the change, let out a low chuckle that died in his throat as the commander's attention turned fully upon them. Richard stepped forward, each bootfall measured and sure, as if the very floor welcomed the weight of someone who walked with purpose. He removed his cap with a deliberate motion, tucking it beneath his arm, and let the silence of the room fill the space where lesser men might have spoken too soon. When he did speak, his voice was low, firm, and carried the kind of authority that comes not from rank alone, but from a life lived in service of something greater than self. "Morning, gentlemen," Richard said, his tone polite but edged with steel. "Something seems out of place here." Robert swallowed hard, finding his voice but not the courage to match it. "We were just having a little fun, that's all. No harm meant." Richard's eyes narrowed just a fraction, the hint of a frown touching his mouth. "Fun at the expense of a man who stood when others couldn't. A man who's given more to this country, to this town, than most will ever know. That's your idea of fun?" The weight of his words settled like a stone in the pit of Robert's stomach. Jeff looked down at the counter, cheeks burning, suddenly fascinated by the worn grain of the wood. The room held its breath. Emily, behind the counter, exhaled softly, the tension in her shoulders easing as if help had finally arrived. The owner stepped out from the back, wiping his hands on a rag, his expression one of quiet relief. Richard turned slightly, his gaze returning to Brandon. The nod they shared then was small, but it carried the force of history, of shared trials, of silent promises kept. And still the room waited, knowing the moment had not yet passed, that the reckoning was not yet complete. The silence in the diner was total, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the quiet tap of a spoon settling in a saucer. The world outside seemed far away, the hum of passing cars muffled by the weight that now filled the room. Commander Richard Cole stood between the tables, boots planted firm on the linoleum, cap tucked beneath his arm. His eyes stayed fixed on Robert and Jeff, but there was no anger in them, only disappointment, a kind that cut deeper than fury ever could. "You sit here," Richard said, his voice low, his tone steady as the rising sun. "And you mock a man who saw things you'll never have to see, a man who carried burdens so you wouldn't have to, a man who came home and lived quietly among you, while good men like Paul Lopez never made it back." Robert's mouth opened, but no words came. The confidence that had driven his mockery drained from him now, leaving only shame in its place. His eyes darted to Jeff, hoping for support, but Jeff stared down at the counter, wishing he could vanish into the wood. Richard didn't need to raise his voice. His words filled the room, reaching every ear, every heart. "Do you think freedom's cheap?" he continued, his gaze sweeping the room, drawing in the silent witnesses, the waitress Emily, the cook, the owner, the trucker sipping his coffee in the corner. "Do you think you can sit here, safe and free, and tear down the men who paid the price for it?" Robert shifted on his stool, his shoulders hunched, the weight of the commander's gaze too much to bear. "We didn't mean nothing by it," he mumbled, the bravado gone, replaced by a boy's hollow excuse. Richard's eyes softened, but his words remained firm. "You meant everything by it," he said, "because what we choose to say, and what we choose to stay silent on, shows who we really are." The owner stepped forward then, emboldened by Richard's presence, by the truth laid bare before him. His voice was quiet but resolute. "I think it's best you boys move along for today," he said, nodding toward the door. Robert hesitated, looking for some lifeline that wasn't there. Jeff slid off his stool first, his face red, his gaze fixed on the floor as he shuffled toward the exit. Robert followed, his steps slow, heavy with the weight of a lesson hard learned. The bell over the door jingled as it closed behind them, the sound of their retreat leaving the diner quieter than it had been in years. Richard turned then, facing Brandon fully. The nod they shared was one of equals, men who had carried the weight of duty, who knew the cost of silence, who understood the value of respect earned and respect owed. And slowly, like sunlight creeping over the horizon, the room breathed again. Emily refilled Brandon's coffee without a word, her hand steady now. The owner gave a small, respectful nod, his eyes meeting Brandon's in silent apology. The air in the diner felt lighter, but the truth of the moment lingered, as it should, a reminder etched in the hearts of all who'd witnessed it. The door's bell had barely stopped ringing when the atmosphere in the diner began to shift, the heaviness lifting as if the weight of unspoken shame had been carried out with Robert and Jeff. The light seemed brighter now, the morning sun spilling through the windows, casting long bars of gold across the worn floor. The air no longer felt tight in the chest, but open, clean. Brandon Atkins sat still in his booth, his hands resting on the table, his coffee warm once more as Emily quietly topped it off. She did so with a care that spoke more than words ever could, a gesture of respect, of quiet apology. Commander Richard Cole eased into the booth across from him, the leather seat creaking beneath his weight. He placed his cap gently on the table between them, as if to mark this moment as one of peace, not command. His eyes met Brandon's, and in them was the kind of understanding that only those who've walked the same hard roads can share. For a long moment, they said nothing. No words were needed. The diner's quiet hum filled the space where speech might have been. The clink of dishes, the low murmur of conversation returning, but softer now, more thoughtful. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice gentle, carrying the weight of memory. "I think of Paul often," he said, "and men like him, men like you. I don't know that we ever do enough for you, Brandon, but some of us, we try." Brandon's gaze softened, the hard lines of his face easing as he drew a slow breath. His voice, when it came, was low, worn, but steady. "We all try. Some of us don't get the chance to finish." Richard nodded, his throat tightening. The owner of the diner approached then, not as a businessman, but as a man who had witnessed something that left him changed. He set a fresh plate down, eggs, toast, and bacon, and placed his hand lightly on the table. "On the house, Brandon, and thank you." Brandon inclined his head, the gesture small but full of meaning. Around the room, the other patrons offered small acknowledgments, a nod from the trucker at the counter, a quiet "God bless you" from an older woman near the window, a young man's lifted hand in a silent salute. The air was different now, not because of a single speech or act, but because a community had remembered, if only for a morning, what it meant to honor the quiet hero in their midst. And through the window, the town's flag caught the breeze, its stripes rippling bold and bright against the blue. The morning had worn on, the sun climbing higher, casting warm light through the diner's broad windows. The town beyond stirred to life. Delivery trucks rumbled past. The sound of a school bell drifted on the breeze. A flag over the courthouse stirred proudly in the strengthening wind. Inside, the air had softened, the weight of earlier shame replaced by something steadier, something right. Brandon Atkins finished his meal slowly, savoring each bite not for the food itself, but for the peace that had settled around him. The coffee warmed him more now, not from heat, but from the comfort of quiet respect restored. He wiped his hands on a worn napkin, folded it neatly and rose, his field jacket settling over his shoulders like an old friend's hand. Commander Richard Cole stood with him, their movements unhurried, unforced. Together they stepped out into the sunlight, the bell above the door offering a final gentle chime as if to mark the moment's end. The breeze met them outside, carrying the scent of cut grass and spring dust. The flag above the diner flapped in full stride now, the stars and stripes clear and proud against the blue. They stood for a moment in its shadow, two men bound not by blood, but by duty, by loss, by the quiet knowing of what it cost to walk through the fire and come out the other side. Brandon's gaze lingered on the flag, and when he spoke, it was more to the wind, to the memory of a friend, to the promise kept. Some debts can't be paid in words, but they can be remembered. Richard nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than any speech. And side by side, they walked down the street, their steps sure, the town's heart beating a little stronger in their wake. Today we remember, always forward. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.